Patricia Hill Collins is a social theorist that has analyzed the intersections of race, gender, social class, and sexuality over the course of her ongoing career. Collins was born in 1948 to Eunice Randolph Hill and Albert Hill. An only child, Collins was a quiet but diligent student, and she's part of a cohort of working class youth who had educational opportunities that were long denied to their parents. Collins' colleague Elizabeth Higginbotham writes that during the 1950s and 1960s, most northern cities had public schools that were channels for social mobility. These schools were not easy on young black girls, and this experience, among others, provided the framework for Collins' work much later in life. I was increasingly the first or one of the few or the only African American and/or woman and/or working class person in my schools, communities, and work settings. Collins, 2000. She received her BA in sociology from Brandeis University in 1969. Collins chose sociology because it blended science and thought. And then in 1970, she received her MAT from Harvard University in social science education, and her education came full circle when she received a PhD of sociology from Brandeis University in 1984. Currently, Collins is a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, as well as being honored as the Charles Phelps Taft Distinguished Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Cincinnati. Collins emerged onto the academic scene in 1986 with her article, Learning from the Outside Within: The Sociological Significance of Black Feminist Thought, published in Social Problems. Collins, 1986, explains, I argue that many black female intellectuals have made creative use of their marginality, their outsider within status, to produce black feminist thought that reflects a special standpoint on self, family, and society. She realized early on that black men and women's experiences vastly differ, and the unique perspective that black women bring has heavily influenced the majority of her work. Her first book, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, published in 1990 with a second edition in 2000, aims to document the existence of a collective knowledge that African American women had created and to sketch out its contours. She's been a champion for black women throughout her entire career and will continue to do so far into the future. Collins engages in black feminist, womanist, and intersectional activism, but she is also conscious of the importance of connecting with women across the waves. At Brandeis, Collins became close with Pauli Murray, a pivotal figure for black women during the civil rights movement, and learned that those who gain in one era have to work for social change over the coming years. Her work reaches across disciplines in an effort to build a community of black women. This makes it difficult to pinpoint a central argument in her activism. However, empowerment of black women is always at the forefront of the discussion. Collins believes that education and access empowers black women, and while her work is well researched and firmly rooted in academia, she makes an effort to utilize accessible language. I could not write a book about black women's ideas that the vast majority of African American women could not read and understand. Collins, 2000. She also argues that it's not enough to simply have a wide breadth of knowledge about social issues. She views black feminism as a critical knowledge project. It's important to be critical of society, analytical about the conditions in which you are situated. I would argue that the framework of intersectionality initially was such a knowledge project. Collins works to reframe the original perspective that are prevalent in academia because of the power systems in play. Sexism, racism, and classism have created the canon, and Collins wants to break down those barriers and expose the myriad of opinions and perspectives that exist, for her, focusing on the black women's lens. Having read a plethora of white feminist thought without recognizing myself in my lived experience, or the lived experiences of my mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and countless godmothers, aunties, and big sister mentors, I celebrate and appreciate the ways that black feminist thought speaks to us, explains Katherine Gines, 2015. Collins' work has done a lot for legitimizing, for lack of a better term, the study of black feminism. However, until the oppressive power systems that cause the ridiculous need to legitimize a major part of the population are eradicated, her vision for what society could be will never come into fruition. The dangerous ideas that have emerged from racism, sexism, and classism dominate academia and equal access, and opportunity are the first step to creating a more inclusive environment for black women. I'm very interested in her arguments supporting intersectionality and the interconnectedness of the systems of oppression that each of us operates under. I'm interested in literacy studies and how dominant literacy practices are established, and there's a lot of overlap between these concepts, particularly the difficulty of the public school system for children of color. Gloria Anzaldúa writes in her essay, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, about the struggles that she experienced in school because of the dominant, read white, literary practices that were forced upon her. I remember being sent to the corner of the classroom for talking back to the Anglo teacher, Anzaldúa writes, when all I was trying to do was tell her how to pronounce my name. As a Chicana, Anzaldúa has a different perspective than Collins, but these microaggressions early on in education, combined with little to no representation of women of color in mainstream scholarship, creates the solitary educational experience that Collins describes in much of her work. I found many similarities and differences between third-wave Black feminism by Kimberly Springer and Collins' work. I found it interesting that Springer notes that there's no guarantee that the work of Chambers, Morgan, or Jones will reach those young people who need it the most, young people who will not be exposed to Black feminist theory and thought in college classrooms. It's important to note that because it's clear that Collins' work is still not considered widespread, even though the first edition of Black feminist thought was released in 1990. Springer also echoes Collins in the conclusion of her article, stating that young Black feminist writers might in fact need to fall in love with the sounds of their own voices. Alternatively, Dicker, 2008, believes that one of the main things uniting the third wave of feminism is its commitment to multiplicity, its belief that a wide range of concerns can be considered feminist. Collins does not identify with the third wave of feminism, rather a completely new brand of Black feminism separate from the third wave that is still heavily influenced by white women. After evaluating the Dicker text, there are some obvious issues with the way that Black women are represented. One of Collins' major critiques is that very few Black women are canonized, and most Black women's voices are essentially lost. The majority of the women mentioned in A History of U.S. Feminisms are the same women that Collins lists often: Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, to name a few. Not to mention that the fact that the only women of color represented in the chapters assigned have been almost exclusively Black. This speaks to the racial issues within the first and second waves of feminism, but Dicker makes little effort to include more women that have not been canonized in this way. Collins' humble, diligent approach to her scholarship and research has allowed thousands of women to find community and representation where there's not been any before. She acknowledged how difficult it was to find a supportive, creative space and decided to create one, despite multiple challenges. Collins says, I've always thought about my ideas as weapons, as tools. I've always thought about my work as bigger than my job. Overall, she is a groundbreaking interdisciplinary researcher whose ideas and work will help to foster future women in their pursuit of liberation and community.